Today we are going to uh, look at um, science notebook. So this is the book that you want your students to write as they are doing science activities in your class. Um, so we actually, as science teachers, we need our students to learn how to do a science notebook. We want to have activities that our students are going to write in this uh, science notebook. So normally you would have something like a composition kind of book where you do all the activities involved in a science notebooking process. So really, we want our students um, to get engaged in the learning process. So let me check my car. So we want our students to get engaged in active science because we are giving them that experience of doing the science notebook, of adding things to their notebook as they conduct their experiments or as they do their activities. And we want them to make sense of all the activities. And science notebooking process is one way they can make sense of the activities. So that is very important. But we also want science notebook to help us with documentation. And really, because you are doing several activities, they improve the cognitive engagement of your students. Your students are able to engage with the materials. As teachers, also you can use science notebook to gain an understanding of what your students are thinking, because at some point you go and check what your students have written, and then from their writings you can determine how to assist them, or you can determine the strengths and weaknesses that your students have and areas that need improvement. And as a teacher also, it helps you to refine your practice. You change your teaching approach based on what your students are writing down. So science notebook is a very important tool for teachers in K-12. Now, when you have this science notebook, what do you put in the science notebook? So you can add any notes that you are writing in your class, experimental activities. If you have figures, when conducting your experiment, you have tables or figures. You want to talk more about these tables and figures. If you just want to brainstorm to discuss things, you can include those discussions in your science notebook. And then you can also put reflections. What have you learned? Summarize what the activities were today. So that can be part of a science notebook. How do we organize science notebook? So we need to make sure that um, the pages in the science notebook are numbered, and there is a reason why we number the pages. So you can number the pages in several ways, but two of them are front to back, so both sides of your paper. Or you may decide, let me pre-number. So let me pre-number the pages in small blocks. So like the first week, you number your book pages 1 to 5, and you have activities based on pages 1 to 5. And then you go on to number your pages 6 to 10. So you are numbering them in blocks based on what you are doing. And numbering is important because of this part. You have to have a table of contents in your science notebook. So for you to have a table of contents, definitely you need page numbers for that. Now, when adding activities in your science notebook, remember each activity to add a date, title of the activity, any other conditions. Maybe you can add things like your partners or what was the weather like that day. So it really depends on what you want your students to learn in the science notebooking process. And when doing all these, you need to let your students know why you are recording. Why are you doing that? What skills do you want your students to learn? Or what understandings do you want your students to gain from this activity? So in terms of table of contents, um, reserve maybe the first 2 pages for table of contents, because as a science notebook process, you'll be adding things that maybe you don't know you'll be adding in the book. So you cannot write the table of contents before the things are added. So leave at least 2 pages at the beginning of your book for table of contents. How you want to write your table of contents will depend on what you want your students to learn. So you may write them based on the names of the investigations or the topics of the investigations, or maybe you may write them in terms of the concepts that your students are learning. I think the simplest way is just to write them in terms of the names of the investigation. Also, you can put maybe some specific activities that you want to highlight, right? So you can ignore the other activities, but you may say, I think these activities should be included in the table of contents. You can also do that, as long as the table of content is really simple and easy to use for your students. Apart from the table of contents, right, at the end of your book, the last pages of your book, you need to add an index. So an index really gives you the vocabulary that is within your science notebook. Someone can go to the index, find a word there, and look in the science notebook and find exactly where the word is. So it is really an index is a very good scientific tool because it teaches kind of things like science literacy. Right? You you have you understand the vocabulary of science. So this index, you can put it in alphabetical order, say A to Z, right? Or you can assign a block of letters, and we will see what this means. I mean, one example is of a block of letters is you want to talk about liquids. So you can have liquid as your title of the index, and then put all the characteristics or the examples of liquids in your science notebook. Or you want to talk about energy, so you can put energy as a block letter, and then below energy you have terms that have to do with energy within the science notebook. So a student can just go to the index and say, let me look something up for something that is talking about energy and find out what terms or what words are under energy. And then once the student find the words, they can go back to their book and look for exactly where those words are found. So an example is like shown here. This is a blocked index. You can see here we are looking at uh, the term liquid. So this is a blocked index. So liquid is foamy, forms, bubbly, viscous, flows, pour. So all those terms are related to liquid. So a student can just go to their index and look under liquid and see what terms are there. Now, when you talk about a science notebook, um, you need to think about the entries. You don't just put things in there. There must be a purpose when putting things in the science notebook. What we are saying is, in your science notebook, focus, the big focus should be putting experiments in your science notebook. What are these experiments? The experiments we are talking about here are inquiry type of experiments. In these types of experiments, you start with a focus question. So you want your students to respond to a question. So one of these you can just say, what is the effect of sunlight on green plants? So that is your focus question. Your students are going to do an investigation to answer that focus question. So focus question is one of the notebook entries. Now, the type of focus question or the type of focus questions that you teach your students will depend on the level of your students. If you are dealing with kindergartners, definitely you are going to use just single words. If you are dealing with second graders, just simple observation, right? Maybe and some simple summaries or using new vocabularies. If you are dealing with um, fifth graders, now you have these coherent questions that they need to investigate, something that is more complex that you want your students to investigate. At early stages, you don't want to really be hard on your students in terms of grammar. Let them be kids, let them be young, let them be students. But later on, you at the beginning you relax the grammar rules, but later on you become more and more serious about these rules. Because in terms of learning, you want to do two things. You want them to learn the science, but you want them also to be able to report the science. But you don't want to be harsh, too harsh on them. You want them to be creative. And you need to encourage them to communicate using various approaches in their book. So encourage them having charts, graphs, drawings, or just writings, color coding numbers, or maybe they can just attach something as they are entering materials in their notebook. So the notebooking process, as a teacher, it needs your support. You need to support your students. You need to guide them through making a science notebook or through adding entries in the science notebook. So in this case, one way to do that is to create a class notebook so that your students have a template of what is expected of them to do. Even when you create this class notebook, you need to make it accessible. You need to put it somewhere where they can see it. In terms of supporting students in the science notebook process, there are two things that you can do. You can provide them what we call supports and scaffolds or scaffolds. So you can provide them supports and scaffolds. These two terms are different when you look at the science notebook process. When we say a support, we are talking about something that is permanent. So for example, here we said that you can have a class notebook. So you create a class notebook and put it somewhere. That class notebook will be there for the whole semester. So we can say the class notebook is a permanent fixture in your classroom. And because it's a permanent fixture, it is called a support. While scaffolds are temporal, so they are temporary. Scaffolds are available only when your students need them. For example, a student has a question on something. You can answer that question. That is part of scaffolding. Or maybe you give your students maybe sentence starters when they are developing their sentences. Maybe they don't have a clear idea how to start their sentences. So you can provide sentence starters. Those ones are scaffold. You just provide them when needed. They are not permanent fixture in your classroom. And actually, the scaffolds will change each and every time based on need. So, in terms of your science notebook, the scaffolds are going to provide structure. Structure like how to insert your observation, how to start your sentences, right? Where do you put your focus question? You can do that by scaffolding as the students are doing their activities. And really, as I said earlier, the scaffolds, they are not permanent, therefore they change each and every time. The scaffolds you give at the beginning of the semester are different from the scaffolds you are going to give at the end of the semester, because your students are learning as you conduct the science notebook activity. So they are improving, therefore they need maybe more complex scaffolds than the ones that you give at the beginning of the semester. So two types of scaffolds that you can give your students are sentence starters or drawing starters and frames. So the sentence starters are going to provide the beginning point of your notebook entry. So you are starting the sentences for your students. For example, you can say as a sentence starter, I know this because, and your student can finish that sentence, but you have started a sentence for the student. In terms of frames, frames are a little bit different from sentence starters because frames usually leave blank spaces in between the sentence. So you can see here the blank space here, the blank space here. We planted blank seeds and used blank to water them. So this sentence we have here is a frame. Is a frame. Your student will just need to fill the blanks in that frame. But really, starters and frames do kind of similar things. But that is something that you can give your students as you conduct the science notebook activity. Another way you can support your students as they conduct the activities is to ask them to think aloud, to think aloud as they are doing the activities. For example, maybe they are checking a millipede, right? They have a diagram of a millipede there. You want them to describe it, and you just ask them, can you verbalize your description as you are writing down? So the student will say, oh, now I see a millipede. It looks like it has so many legs. Its color is this and this and this. So as they are talking to you, they are also writing down what they are talking. In that case, you are helping them uh, to form a coherent understanding of what is happening as they do the activities for their science notebook. So what you are looking for is to verbalize thoughts used to create a particular notebook entry. I am going to observe another kind of rock. I am going to look back to see how I recorded rock information before. Oh, I see. I see that I made a large detailed drawing. So they are verbalizing the activities and they are writing down as they are verbalizing the activities. So this type of support is known as a think aloud. So when conducting this, sometimes it's hard for the students to conduct science activities while writing down. So you may decide to say that now please conduct the experiment. After some time, let them find a place somewhere where they can write down, where they can work on their science notebook. So some teachers would like their students to do the activities and then find a table where they can just write down what they have done so that they are not confused conducting the activities at the same time and then writing at the same time. And actually, as they are writing down as a teacher, you're walking around and determining what they are doing, seeing if they are writing the correct material, asking them again about the focus question, revisiting the focus question, and they are revisiting the task they just did. All this time, you are supporting your students as they are conducting these activities. So, as I said at the beginning, we talked about science notebook entry. In every science notebook, you need to have a focus question or a challenge, and then you need to have an activity that answers that focus question or that gives you information about that challenge. So as you are doing this activity, you are going to collect data. After you collect your data, you make sense of the activity. So like making sense of the science process. What is the purpose of this focus question? You cannot do an investigation if you don't have any question to investigate, or you cannot do an investigation if you don't have any problem that you want to investigate. So the focus question establishes this direction and conceptual challenge for the activity. So as a teacher, you can display the focus question of the day on the board so that every student can read before they start working on their activity. Introduce the focus question. You can put it in a chat form, or you can put it in the PowerPoint form, or you can give them just photocopies of the question at each group of uh, the students. After the focus question, give them proper direction in terms of planning based on their level of understanding. You may be you may decide to say, I want to be more involved in their planning. If you are teaching up to K3, if you are dealing with K4 and above, you may say, I want to give them more independence. If you are dealing with K8 and high school, you want even to give them even more independence in their planning. So, as someone guiding them, just give them an idea what type of procedure you want them to include in the science notebook, or the procedures that they need to conduct that investigation. And that procedure, will it give them enough data for them to write anything about it? Almost always you want them to become scientists. You want them to work as scientists. So one way that we do science is making predictions. So create space in the science notebook for them to make predictions. Provide a frame for them to make those predictions. I think if I do this, this is going to happen. Because so you're providing sentence starters for prediction so that you just give them an idea how to make those predictions. But as a scientist, you want to add predictions in the science notebook. Now, after making those predictions, they are going to collect data. So data is just information that we collect when we do our activities. And you need to make sure to connect the data they are collecting to the focus question. And another thing about data collection is how you are going to handle the data. So you are doing your activities. There are two ways that you can handle the data, or two phases. Phase one is collecting the data or acquiring the data. Phase two is display. You can add both of those in your science notebook. During the data acquisition, you can just be writing down whatever is happening. You don't need to arrange it in a specific way because it's just you obtaining the data. But then when you sit down, then you can decide, I want to put this data in terms of chart. I want to put this data in terms that can give me a trend of the data. So acquisition is just making observations and recording data. So if it's about words, phrases, numbers, or drawings. While data display is looking at reorganizing your data in a logical way. So you want your students to be able to obtain the trends. You want your students to be able to explain the data based on how they display the data. So examples that we can use a narrative, drawings, artifacts, tables, graphs, images, among other things. Your job as a teacher is to provide guidance as the students are conducting this activity. After you collect your data, after you display your data, you need to make sense of the data. So that is data analysis. You can do that through whole group discussions. So you ask your students to develop tables for their data and go in front and present. As they are presenting as a class, you are discussing the data. You are looking at the new vocabularies the students are sharing, what they have learned from the data. Then, because in all that data collection, you are trying to answer a question, a research question. So during the making sense of science, you want to revisit that focus question, and then your students should answer the question based on the data or based on the discussion that you have just had. So, in simple terms, science notebook process is one of the biggest processes in terms of teaching. If you want to teach through inquiry, this is a process that enables our students to act as scientists in the classroom. And making sense of the data is a big part of the science notebook process. And in terms of making sense of data, I am adding that the data will provide evidence for you to explain your observations or for you to explain your answers to the focus question. That's the whole process. Right? You have the data, and then you're coming back to your focus question using your data. So you want your students to explain their thinking. As they're explaining, they are providing support, evidence from what they collected. An example here is we know that objects that have a round surface will roll because a ball and a can both rolled and they have round surfaces. So that is evidence based on the activity. As a teacher, you need to make sure that when your students are making sense of the science process, they are making reference to specific observations in their notebook. So when a student raises his or her hand to answer a question, and then you can ask, where did you write that information? Do you have that information in your science notebook? Did you observe that when doing this activity? So making sense of data is really an important part of the science notebook process. So let's look at this investigation. This class, they were answering the question, what is the difference between a red worm and night crawler? To answer this question, students observed and recorded the data using their notebook. And then actually they were able to do things like creating a Venn diagram with an input from students. And then after that, that activity, they hear the focus question again. And as a teacher, the teacher asked them to discuss their thinking. And then the teacher wrote a frame. So this is the frame that the teacher wrote. One difference between a red worm, or a sentence starter or a frame in this case. One difference between a red worm and a night crawler is, I know this because. So the teacher is providing guidance to the students as they are conducting their activity, but also is letting the student make a conclusion based on their observation. If you are doing this for a class that is higher, like grade 6 and above, you expect the students to make these sentences on their own. If you are dealing with grades 4 and below or 3 and below, it is expected that you provide more guidance to the process. So these are some examples of what the students are writing. Here we have red worm and a night crawler. What are isopods? Effects of volcanic eruption. So you can see this is your focus question here. Effects of volcanic eruption. And then the students are answering the focus question by just adding stickers to the book. So in terms of your science notebook, you can put it in a way that you want, based on what you want your students to do, based on what the objectives of the lessons are, and based on the level of your students. But in brief, science notebook is a very important process that as teachers we need to practice how to use it, and we need to know how to effectively gain enough information from the science notebook activity. Thank you.